Serving in the Peace Corps in India was the most bizarre experience of my entire life. No way was one unarmed civilian in a village of 2,000 people going to foist irrigation methods on anybody. What you do instead is adopt local customs and mannerisms and use those. It's not an easy process. One thing I did, like the Indians, was leave my front door open so people could come and go at will. And come and go they did. You'd sit down to write a letter and somebody would come. Not somebody you knew, just somebody who came to stare. You'd keep the writing pose so he could see you were busy and keep it short. "Have you eaten?" he would ask. "Yes." He'd smile and bob approvingly. "What curry?" "Squash." "Did you have rice?" "No." "Paratas." "What? No rice? That's no meal?" Your insides would tighten. Let's see. "How old are you?" 24. "How many children?" "No, I'm not married." "What? 24 and not married?" "How much is your salary?" None of your business." "What is your qualification?" You sat for that precise inquisition, word for word, several times a day. The parade of inquisitors never exceeded 3 or 4 at once, and nobody stayed more than about 5 minutes, so you couldn't blame anybody for the fact that in 2 hours and 45 minutes, your letter hasn't gotten past "Dear Mom." But your patience was wearing thin. You hated to be inhospitable, but there were limits. They should have seen you were busy and left you alone, and the next joker through the door was going to hear about it. At that point, the procession would stop. You'd be coiled to strike, and there'd be nobody to strike at. With a timing so perfect, it would mystify you again and again. They would lead you to the brink of mayhem and leave you with no one to commit it on. Alone to stew in your bile till you settled down. Then it would start again. What is your caste? In America, there is no caste. All are one caste? No, there is no caste. India is the only land with caste. You're ultimately determined to be of the Christian caste. Later, the tables turned. After 3 months trying this, trying that, I finally got my first job, and it was my turn to barge through somebody's front door. The job was with 2 brothers named Ramalu and Chandraya. I went to Chandraya's door and started in when the force of custom stopped me cold. I'd seen many Indians walk through doors without knocking, hundreds through mine alone. But I was an outsider. What would they think if I did the same thing? Conversely, would knocking belittle their sense of hospitality? Unable to decide, I retreated to my house. The minute I did, the fog cleared and I knew, walk right in. I'd do it after breakfast. So after breakfast, I went back and the fog returned. The door was wide open. Chandraya was lying on a mansam. Ramalu was sitting beside him. I shifted around trying to catch their eye, but they didn't see me. Again, I turned away. It was one thing to realize that knocking is henceforth null and void. It was quite another to overpower a lifetime of conditioned responses. Still, turning away, I knew, walk right in. I went back, stepped through the door, and the brothers greeted me with delight. Villagers would swear they were going to meet you at specific times and places, then invariably leave you wondering where they were. Occasional appointments you might let slide, but all of them? Why would they say they were going to meet you and then not do it? It takes a good 3 months to work out that when they say they're going to meet you at a certain time and place, their words don't mean what they clearly say to you. What they actually do mean is something else again. I finally worked out that it was a gesture of sincere intent. Believing that at least allowed me to deal with it. It wasn't just appointments, it was everything. 7 days a week, 24 hours a day, 360 degrees in all directions. Cultures differ, sometimes radically, and the differences are rock-ribbed. You might even think they were genetic. They're not, they're learned, but they're that intractable. They're real, and it has nothing to do with who's right and who's wrong, and that's what we're going to be talking about. Among the people kidnapped early in the Iraq War were 4 Japanese civilians. When Americans return home, we greet them with yellow ribbons, brass bands, and ticker tape parades. Those Japanese civilians returned home in shame and disgrace. They had dishonored their country. Now, we find a hard time finding logic in such a response, but we have to trust that it fits a pattern that makes overall sense in the Japanese context. It doesn't make them wrong. The anthropologist Edward T. Hall said, "Culture is not an exotic notion studied by a select group of anthropologists in the South Seas. It is more than mere custom that can be changed or shed like a suit of clothes. It is a mold into which we all are cast and controls our daily lives in many unsuspected ways. Our lives, not just Hottentots and Eskimos, but you and me right here in 21st century America." Hall made those statements back in 1959, but somehow we still don't seem to have got the message. You can talk about culture till you're blue in the face and still not give a comprehensible picture of what it really is. According to Hall, culture is behavioral communication. If you're 45 minutes late for an appointment in America, your behavior communicates an insult to the person waiting for you. In other cultures, 45 minutes is just the beginning of the waiting period. Complaining about 45 minutes there would be about like complaining about 5 minutes here. So when I first started writing my book, I thought I could just describe my cross-cultural experiences and people would automatically get my reactions to them. But nobody did. I even threw in some anthropology from Edward T. Hall, whose book, The Silent Language, I'd quite fortuitously read during the culture shock stage of my experience, but that didn't help either. Something more was needed. But first, I want to say a little bit about culture shock. Culture shock is a milestone in the acculturation process. It affects different people differently, but basically it's a known, mild psychological crisis that occurs at about the end of the 3rd month. Part of it has to do with getting very tired of trying to figure out what's going on, and part of it has to do with deprivation of your own culture. That deprivation affects people in much the same way as withdrawal from addictive substances. It takes about 90 days, on average, to reach a level of exasperation where you're ready to call it quits and go home. Then, almost magically, things start getting better. You begin to realize that they're not yanking you around, not intentionally. They're treating you the way they treat each other, and you need to start giving it back in kind, even if it violates your own sensibilities to do it. Unless you actually go through that psychological ringer, and psychological it very much is, you don't really get what culture is about. It's an Alice in Wonderland reality, like you're the only sane person in a lunatic asylum. Typically, each violation of your sensibilities is small, but they're persistent, pecking away at you like the Chinese water torture. Culture shock is a life-altering experience. You'll never see the world the same way after it as you did before it. How could something so evanescent have such profound effects? It's like the Copernican shift from the Earth-centered to the Sun-centered universe. Frustration trying to explain that perspective in my book is what led me to research the subjects that make up its subtext. Very early, I came up with a title that tried suggesting that going to India was like going to another planet. I was so glad when another writer, Irish novelist Adrian McKinty, used the same words to describe his experience of India. You don't need to leave this planet to find behavior beyond anything science fiction ever dreamed of. Two things occurred to me. One, our science fiction writers are hampered by the inability to escape their own cultural idea pool. Two, I wondered if Freud wouldn't have been totally bamboozled by India. Years later, I found out that Margaret Mead had wondered the same thing about Samoa. In fact, there's a major conflict over that very subject that hasn't been resolved to this day. That the controversy even exists should tell you something about the force of cultural tides. They're very, very powerful. During the writing process, I read every Peace Corps memoir I could get my hands on. Some were very good, and some were very bad, but none tackled the culture issue in any meaningful way. To me, that was the whole reason for writing a memoir. If there was a standout lesson in the experience, that was it. Over time, I became satisfied that mine could keep company with most of them, and I thought my treatment of culture had given it an edge. So in 2002, 33 years after I started, I sent copies of the manuscript to as many of my buddies as I could find to see if anybody objected to the way I'd treated them. Miraculously, nobody did. But one of the guys, who was by then a newspaper editor, made the most incisive comment of any I ever got. 5 words. Too much, he said, is left unexplained. Still, after 33 years? 2 years after that, I finally saw what needed to be done. One page in the middle of the book told in a general way how myth and psychology combined to give cultures their shape. But one page wasn't enough. I needed to develop the ideas throughout the narrative. Also, that page was mostly opinion. If I was going to develop the theme credibly, went forward. I guess we're okay there. All right, that's good. If I was going to develop the theme credibly, it was going to take research, and that's just what I did for 4 more years: mythology, psychology, and anthropology. Now we're up to 39 years. It took me that long to start figuring out how to explain culture. It's that much of a riddle. How do you explain the Copernican shift? We don't feel like we're moving. The sun doesn't look stationary. But to say that culture isn't real or that it doesn't matter is the anthropological equivalent of the Flat Earth Society. So how do myth and psychology affect culture's attitude toward logic? On a bus one time, a couple of the other guys and I, there we go, got a classic taste of Indian logic. We were bouncing along the back seat when we came up behind a lorry going about 2 miles an hour slower than we were. Our driver answered the sound horn sign on the lorry's rear bumper, and the guy should have pulled over and let us by. This one, however, did everything he could do to keep us behind him. At every straight stretch we tried to pass, when the lorry didn't yield, our guy would try going around on the shoulder, and the lorry would swing and cut us off. This dance went on for about 20 miles. At last, the lorry pulled off at a roadside village, and we pulled up beside him, though no stop was scheduled. Our driver started reading the riot act. Soon the whole bus was in on it, people standing up, shouting out the windows. The lorry driver admitted nothing. Our driver got down. The lorry driver got down. People started getting off the bus. We 3 Americans, expecting mayhem to erupt at any minute, kept our seats. But though there was much shouting and many oaths, mayhem did not ensue. Presently, 2 police constables walked out, asked a few questions, and disappeared with the drivers. They were gone a long time. When they returned, our guy was smiling, and everybody let him strut, brag, and smoke cigarettes for 20 minutes before we got underway again. By now, we were 45 minutes late, and with typical Indian perversity, he drove like a madman trying to make up the time. I think there's a reason for India's cavalier treatment of logic, cavalier by our standards. For us, logic is the measure of truth, the measure of reality. For Indians, logic is a handy way to negotiate the material world, but the material world you apply the logic to is pure illusion. In our literature, an early reference to the dualistic way of thinking that led to logic is the story of Adam and Eve. Oops. There we go. Adam and Eve ate the fruit of the tree of knowledge and split the world into pairs of mutually exclusive opposites, male and female, good and evil, life and death, cause and effect. Aristotle glommed onto the theme as a way of verifying reality and created logic. For us to this day, logic is the measure of reality. In India, duality, male and female, good and evil, is accepted as a fact of life in the material world. Logic is an excellent tool for negotiating the material world, and Indians are very good at using it. Some of the world's best scientists and engineers are Indian. But logic can't get you to the truth of existence. If existence is a matter of cause and effect, what about the first cause, the uncaused cause? What caused existence in the first place? Logic can't tell us that. To get there, you have to transcend logic. To us, logic is the measure of truth. In India, truth lies beyond logic. That's why I don't think logic holds quite the same place in India's value system that it does in ours. Now, saying that, I'm aware of being like a man that Albert Einstein once postulated, staring at a fine pocket watch. He sees what's happening on the outside, but can't open the watch to find out how it works. He can formulate elegant theories, but can never be entirely sure they're right. Indian culture is my version of that watch. I can't be entirely sure my theories are right. The West's reliance on logic has deep roots. We look outside ourselves for the truth. There's reason to think that orientation rose when some horse-mounted herders on the Russian steppes elevated the sky god to preeminence during the Bronze Age. Gods and goddesses have always been part of the human story. Female deities have generally been associated with the earth, while male deities have been associated with the sky. Until about 4500 BC, virtually all mythic systems seem to have centered on the earth goddess. She was, to all intents and purposes, the earth itself. The female was the natural choice because, like the female of every species, the earth is the giver of life. Among earth goddess cultures, spirit suffuses all of creation, including humans. Everything is part of the sacred order, of the hierarchy that starts with Vishnu, in India's case, and descends through the lesser deities, humanity, the animals, plants, earth, water, and rocks. In earth goddess systems, higher knowledge tends to show up in some form of shamanism, which looks inward for the truth, not outward. Yoga is thought to have emerged from shamanism. 4,500-year-old seals from the Indus Valley, the cradle of Indian civilization, show figures in the lotus position. Many think shamanism goes all the way back to the Upper Paleolithic, some 25 to 30,000 years ago. In the sky god ethos, spirit is bestowed on us by a father somewhere in a distant area in the sky. The font of our knowledge resides with him. It is to him that we look for wisdom. And in keeping with that orientation, Westerners still look outward for the truth. We bind our truths to external systems of logic, mathematics, and scientific method. We don't trust our inner voices. Give us something that can't be biased. Inward seeking with the earth goddess, outward seeking with the sky god. What about other phenomena? Time. How do myth and psychology affect that? Does it flow in a straight line or in one gigantic circle? To us, time goes in a straight line. It has no beginning, no end. Every event is unique, and it's irreversible. The concept seems to have originated with the ancient Hebrews and was a drastic break from the cyclical concept held by many of the more ancient cultures. Commonly in cyclical time, given enough time, everything realigns itself exactly as it was at the beginning, and the whole cycle repeats itself through cause and effect down to the smallest detail. Whatever else cyclical time may or may not do, it does solve the problem of first causes. And it's a view that creates a psychology that's fundamentally different from ours. In cyclical time, everything has happened before and will happen again. History is predetermined. If you're from a culture that goes by cyclical time, it doesn't mean you know what's going to happen tomorrow, but you do know it's already been written. It may not seem so at first glance, but the notion gives whole populations a much greater sense of security than we have. They don't agonize over their choices the way we do. Why should they? There's nothing they can do about them anyway. A precept of yoga psychology is accepting that right now, in this moment, everything is exactly the way it's supposed to be. If you come from a culture that goes by cyclical time, as India does, that's almost a foregone conclusion. There's a wonderful book called The Arrow of Time that goes into all kinds of physics and mathematics and philosophy to demonstrate that time flows in a straight line. Being a son of Western myth, it all seems to make sense to me, even though the authors themselves end up admitting, after all the physics and mathematics, that the best indication we have that time flows in a straight line is that it seems to. Well, it seems to us because we've been conditioned from childhood to see it that way. If you're conditioned to see it flowing in a circle, it's not very likely that you're going to see it flowing in a straight line. With cyclical time, life is predetermined. With predestination, you don't have choices. Without choice, there's no free will. And free will is one of our belief system's foundation stones. The presumption that free will exists, that we have choice, tells us that we have control over our lives. Most of us would probably find it impossible to imagine not having control over our lives. Now, learning about cyclical time gave me another idea about the villagers' attitude toward appointments. In cyclical time, everything has happened before and will happen again. So you agree to meet somebody at 8 o'clock tomorrow morning, then you wait and see if it happens. If it does, it did. If it doesn't, it didn't. Trying to make something happen of your own free will must make as much sense as trying to reverse the ocean tides. I can't be sure that's the explanation. It makes sense to me, but I'm just a guy staring at a pocket watch. I clearly remember the night my belief system came crashing down. Less than an hour before, I'd been expounding to one of my buddies about the curvature of space. It was something you heard about in the 60s, and I worried about it. If space was positively curved, the universe would eventually reach, or parallel lines would eventually cross, meaning that the universe would, I'm not sure exactly how this works, but this is what they said, the universe would eventually reach a maximum of expansion and begin contracting back into the Big Bang's counterpart, the Big Crunch. If space was negatively curved, parallel lines diverged infinitely, and the universe would keep expanding forever. To me, that was a very chilling thought. Well, I said, everything in nature is cyclical. It wouldn't make sense for the whole in which the parts are subsumed not to be cyclical too. After 19 months in India, cyclicity, a metaphysical assumption that I had absorbed by osmosis, had risen in my mind to the level of scientific proof. Here's something else. Oops. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. That's a fundamental tenet of our belief system. Thomas Jefferson said they're self-evident, so they must be, right? Actually, they're not. Many cultures aren't egalitarian at all, but hierarchical. India, China, Japan, Mexico, their playing field's not horizontal, it's vertical. I seem to have skipped ahead here, folks. Let's see. There we go. Anyway, their playing field is not horizontal, it's vertical. My very first irrigation job was on a 10-acre plot owned by 5 brothers. In exchange for their developing the land by our methods, I agreed to divide the plot equally among them. 5 divisions, with the first at the lowest elevation and the 5th at the highest. Since lower ground is generally more fertile, the eldest brother got the lowest and most fertile plot, the youngest got the highest and least fertile. Nobody questioned the arrangement. For them, hierarchy was the natural order of the universe. Some of the guys in my group, to promote egalitarianism, told their cooks to address them by their first names. My own cook had started out calling me Sar, which I took to be a sort of a cross between Sir and Sahib. It was their system, I wasn't going to tamper with it, and right off had a good relationship with my cook. I was also blessed with a cook who was both honest and a good worker. Still, when he heard about the first name business, he asked me which I preferred. I said it didn't matter. He started calling me Jim, and our relationship deteriorated. Suddenly, he didn't know who was the boss. He began taking liberties that wouldn't even have been tolerated here. In very short order, I resolved to make him revert to Sar, and was very relieved when he volunteered to go back on his own, back to hierarchy, back to the natural order of his universe. The roots of Indian philosophy traced all the way back to the ancient earth goddess fertility cults. The earth goddess is one of 2 major world belief systems. Sky god is the other one. No system is all one or all the other, though the Judeo-Christian does bend most of the way over to the sky god end of the scale. India, especially southern India, retains a preponderance of the earth goddess system. Earth goddess deities are associated with fertility, planting and harvesting, procreation. Sky gods are concerned with more abstract matters like cosmic order, justice, and the order of the planets. A major difference between the earth goddess and the sky god has to do with what might be called the earth goddess version of original sin, and the various types of sacrifice, including human, that figured in her fertility cults. Their sin has nothing to do with incurring the wrath of God through disobedience as ours does. What it has to do with is the very real paradox that, by its very nature, life lives off of death. In order to live, you have to kill and eat. Life and death are mutually interdependent, and the sacrifice had everything to do with atoning for that traumatic reality. In her system, everything, insects, fish, birds, lions, humans, even rocks, water, and fire, are created equal. The antelope was our equal. When we slew it, we committed murder, and the sacrifice had everything to do with atoning for that crime. Through the sacrifice, we returned, in stark, uncompromising terms, something of ourselves to the earth from which we drew our sustenance. Those ideas, or their influence, carried into all later Hindu thought. The mutual interdependence of opposites, like life and death, is a hallmark of Eastern thought, very unlike our mutually exclusive way of viewing opposites. While I was in India, inward versus outward seeking, predestination versus free will, hierarchy versus equality, and cyclical as opposed to linear time, all wormed their ways into my psyche without my even knowing it. How does that work? This is where the psychology comes in. Like children, my comrades and I absorbed things from the society around us more from what people did than from what they said. To this day, I'd be hard put to tell you exactly what it was the Indians did to demonstrate their sense of cyclicity. But after a certain point, there was never a doubt that it was central to their belief system. The same goes for inward seeking, predestination, and Indian logic. All of that came clear only after decades of research and reflection. All I knew at the time was that to function in their culture, it helped to adopt their mannerisms. By adopting them, I began assimilating the belief system behind them. Inexorably, without my even knowing it, elements of their system began showing up in my behavior. The process is called going native. And that's exactly how children develop. They start absorbing ideas before they know they're learning anything. The infant mind has astounding absorptive powers. At 3 days, it can distinguish the sound of its own language from that of a foreign language. In fact, a recent study suggested that an infant's laugh, fresh from the womb, already has the accent of its native country. Nobody teaches a child how to speak, but by the age of 6, it has a 10,000-word vocabulary. I read somewhere that a child learns half of everything it will ever know in its first year of life. I didn't note the source and haven't been able to find it again, but a Montessori teacher I know reinforced the idea. 2 others from a more conventional school said age 3. No matter by whose measure, early childhood is extremely important in creating the adults who populate a society and in perpetuating the things the society believes. We learn these things before we're aware we're learning anything, more from what people do than from what they say. When they enter our psyches, they do it not as options to be accepted or rejected, but as elements of the natural order. Our parents absorbed them from their parents without knowing they were doing it, and their parents absorbed them from theirs. Our parents impart them to us unawares, and we impart them to our children unawares. By the time anybody's old enough to change, the pattern is set. Not just set, it's invisible. We don't know it's there. We don't even know there's anything that could change. The elements of our culture operate on us in the same way that neuroses do, decisively, but utterly out of our awareness. The difference is that culture tends to be functional, while neuroses don't. And that's my take. A 3-legged stool, mythology, psychology, and anthropology to explain culture. We have our reality, other cultures have theirs, and it has nothing to do with who's right and who's wrong. Thank you very much.